Hello. So my real objective today is to persuade one or two of you to become climate fanatics and put some of your money behind it. That would be way overachieving based on my previous record. But every now and then we snag somebody, and there's a handful of hedge fund types who really are behind the environment, and it's made a huge difference. My credentials on this topic are that I've been obsessed with climate change for 15 years, and the Grantham Foundation now has 3 well-qualified full-time, 2.5-time employees, 2 full-time, 1 half-time. And we spend a big chunk of our time looking at green problems and green investment opportunities. 20% of our foundation is invested in venture capital of a green nature, mission-driven. Of the remainder, over another 30% of the total is in venture capital of other types. So we have over 50% of the foundation. The foundation has 98% of my net worth, so you could say that we are all in. I'm happy to say it just reached $1 billion. This is a good industry to be in if you wanted to make money. In the past, what it's going to be like in the future, I won't vouch for. My 3 helpers and I spend a lot of time with talking directly to top scientists and top entrepreneurs. So we see to some considerable degree the disrupting waves that are going to come down the pipeline and disturb everybody in the next few years. And the technology is extremely exciting and unexpected. It really is moving faster than anyone guessed on a wide front. My credentials on sustainability are really hinge on a paper I wrote 2011 called Time to Wake Up, the days of cheap and plentiful resources are gone forever. It's the only paper I ever wrote that was widely read. I had quite a few million readers, and probably the second place letter of my lifetime is less than 1/10 of that. The bad news is, the moment the letter came out, China stopped growing for a while, and they had been growing at double-digit in iron ore and coal and resources. They had gone in 40 years from 3 or 4% of global coal demand to 50. And in 2011, they were 50% of every bag of cement, every ton of coal, every ton of iron ore, completely unprecedented by a wide margin. And then the following year, the increase in coal was 0, and the following year, and the following year. So they went from growing at 8 a year, and then accelerated for 7 years to 12, followed by 0, 0, 0. That will do wonders for coal pricing, iron ore pricing, and everything else. So my 2011 report, X marks the spot where the cycle peaked. However, the proposition, I think, was correct. The old era of declining prices and plentiful supplies has indeed gone. The thing about sustainability, to set the really big picture, is the topic of growth. You can have sustainability or you can have growth, but you can't have both. And my favorite economist, fellow Yorkshireman, Kenneth Boulding, now deceased, said famously, anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. Economics has completely avoided this topic. They say it takes capital and labor. And I say, try making a loaf of bread without wheat and heat or energy. It has been a vastly, painfully oversimplified business, mainstream economics of the last 50 years. There's 1 or 2 economists, some of them quite brilliant, who consider these questions, limitations of the natural capital, natural environment, and resources, but they have been marginalized. I was down here in New York, in Brooklyn, at the Center for Supercomputing, and this was in '07. And the previous 2 years, globally, had 4.5% GDP growth on a global basis. And so I posed to these PhDs in mathematics and computer science this question, which I'm giving you the answer in advance. I said, let's imagine the longest lived civilization, which is Egypt. 3,000 years, the same pharaohs, the same religion, the same language. It's quite remarkable. And let's say we start with a pyramid full of possessions. That's all they have. The entire Egyptian empire fills one of the great pyramids. And it grows at 4.5%, a growth rate which we aspire to on a global basis today. What would have happened over the 3,000 years of their sustained empire? And I refused to go on until these mathematicians had made a few guesses, and none of them came within a billionth of the right answer, which is a pretty good error for a mathematician. And the answer is that the sheer physical mass of the goods produced in year 3000 would fill about 100 galaxies equal to the Milky Way. That's a lot of stuff. And that assumes that you have thrown away all the stuff you accumulated in the previous 2,999 years. So then we say, what about 1%? How about if ancient Egypt had increased its population at 1%? That's a despicable, a spat-upon rate of growth for an economist. And counterintuitively, in my opinion, anyway, this would have multiplied the population of Egypt by 9.2 trillion times. Now, the good news about the iPhone these days is you can whip it out and check. This is the good news, bad news. It means that what I say has to be accurate. 9.2 trillion times is what you get compounding 1% for a lousy 3,000 years. How about 0.1, 20 times? Population in Egypt probably about doubled in that 3,000 years. You cannot compound, guys, so bear it in the back of your mind. No one talks about this. Environmentalists jump up and down nervously and say, for God's sake, don't mention that. You'll lose everybody. You'll lose all the politicians. No politician is prepared to talk about limiting growth of physical output in a world where, of course, by mathematical definition, we must do precisely that. These economists who ignore the limitations assume that resources are infinite, and this is what it looks like. You may know the idea, the experiment of the bacteria in a petri dish. The bacteria doubles. That's how it goes. Pop, double, double. And it doubles until it's used up all the sugar in the petri dish, and then they all die. It's spectacular. Let's assume they double 60 times, 60 minutes between 11 o'clock and 12 o'clock. And you ask the bacteria, when should you start getting nervous? How about when what you have done is outgunned by what remains, the oil resource that remains, is 7 times what you have used? Well, no sweat at all. That is 3 minutes to 12. You have 3 doubles left. And where we are today is there's probably more oil out there than we have produced, which means we're inside 2 minutes to 12. There is about 1 plus a little bit of a double from here. And this is what it looks like if you cheat and plot it on an arithmetic scale. The output of 2,000 years of GDP, nothing happens until 1850, and then whoomph. You are using up all the sugar. And this is the oil running out of sugar. 100 years, the price of oil is at $22 in today's currency. It has enormous volatility. The normal volatility in oil is more than a double, less than a half. So if it's 22, you expect it to go to 46 or 10, and it did. It did it rather well behaved, actually. And then the OPEC crisis of 72.34, and it bounces up to 45. And around that 45, it has exactly the same volatility, more than a double, less than a half, so it goes back to 16 for a second, or 18, and goes up over 100. And yet it's clearly changed. If it had gone to 110 on the old trend, that's a 1 in 1,000-year outlier. If it goes to 110 when it's bounced to 45, hey, that's a normal spike. And then, early this century, it jumps again, bang, in the period that I was writing about in 2011, when all resources of every kind were shooting upwards. By the way, they went up faster between 2000 and 2011 than they had in World War II. No one talked about it, it just happened. And of course, it was driven mainly by China, but also by the growth rate of the entire world beginning to run out of the really cheap resources. So now, here we are at about 75, 80, it might be 70 even, but it is a lot higher than 22. So this is the great paradigm shift in an important resource. It is not 22, it will not go back to 22 until the Teslas overcome the planet, and we give up driving internal combustion engines, which we will do, and we'll do actually pretty fast. So this is a description of the world as we used to know it. We were beginning to run out of oil, ironically just at the time as demand also is going to back away. A quick look at what's available on a long-term basis. We have lots of oxygen, that's pretty good, and silicon, and everything else not so much. But there are two exceptions to my harangue. There is plenty of iron and plenty of aluminum. So everything in the future is going to trend towards being made of aluminum or iron. 8.2% of the Earth's crust. And now we look at everything else we consider important today in the metal world. Listed at the bottom: nickel, zinc, copper, cobalt, lithium, lead, tin, uranium, molybdenum, silver, platinum, gold, palladium, added together is 0.03. Just compare the 0.03 to the 8.2% of aluminum, and you will realize there is a cosmic difference between things we really need: copper, nickel, zinc, uranium, lithium, and aluminum and iron. No one realizes this. The price trends reflect that. Price of aluminum is still clearly trending down. Price of iron ore may be trending down, maybe flat, but the price of the others never was flat. The price of these really rare metals has always been flat and is going to trend its way up for sure. So we have energy that's on its way up. We have most of the metals that matter to us, except two, trending up. And we have agricultural prices that have been trending up for a long time, although the basic corn and soybeans are still pretty flat. And larger population, of course, makes it worse. If we had the population of 1900 today, 1 billion people, there'd be no problem. The technology today is sufficient to carry us to glory and solve the problems of poverty and climate change and resource limitations. If, of course, we had the technology of 1900 in today's population, we would be toast. We would have no hope. As it is, we have a very real hope. But the growth in population is the killer. No one mentions it in polite circles. NGO world won't mention it. They lose donations. You can't talk about it in reference to Africa, or you'll be called an imperialist swine. But look at this, and this is on a log scale. When Malthus wrote, it was just over 1 billion. When I was born, just over 2 billion. And now it's 7.5 billion. It's tripled in my lifetime. This is crazy. 3.5 times. And it's on its way, according to the UN, to 11.2 billion. We are going to have the very devil of a time feeding 11.2 billion. As in, I, for one, would bet against it. We can't do it. And this is the problem. The rest of the world is not doing badly. 6.2 going to 7.2 and then back to 6.7. And I would bet a little bit less than that. So after 2050, it will be in decline. If we could buy a couple of hundred years of fairly stable civilization, the rest of the world might work its way back to 4 billion towards a level that is long-term sustainable in terms of the natural environment and resources. The problem is Africa. All of the 3 billion increase is Africa, basically. Nigeria, when I was born, 28 million Nigerians. Today, 190. The UN mid-range forecast for 2100 is 780 million more than Europe and North America added together. Needless to say, some of you are thinking that does not compute. What will happen is Nigeria will be a failed state. Nigeria is trying to be a failed state, in my opinion, as we sit. In Africa, I would say there are 5 failed states. There are 5 that are trying to fail. And it's harder to be a successful state when you're surrounded by failing states. They have the worst soil of any continent outside the Antarctic. They have the worst governance, the biggest distances to travel. And frankly, the rest of the world doesn't care that much. How do we feed them? How do we feed 11.2 billion? First of all, you don't hear enough about diminishing returns. Racehorses don't run any faster today than they did 30, 40 years ago. Secretariat still has the world record on dirt. We've been breeding racehorses for thousands of years. You can't get blood out of a stone. They break their legs more, but they don't run any faster. And then you look at wheat, and if you're looking for diminishing returns, what you do is you go to the best producers. You go to Japan, rice, and Northern Europe for wheat, and this is what you see. For 15 going on 20 years now, the steady productivity gains that had lasted for 100 years have topped out. So that's point one you do not hear about. The second point is erosion. This is the erosion that has taken place in Iowa, or one particular county outside a public library. They show you in 1850 they had 14 inches of thick, black, rich topsoil. And then in 1900, 11.5, 9.5, 7, and in 2000, 5.5. Now, let me point out, you need 4 is perfect, 3 you really need. Between 3 and 2, you start to get hurt, and below 2, you might as well forget it. We called them up, tracked them down, and they said, yes, we're more concerned. The rate of erosion is slowing. People are much more concerned about it, but the latest measurement is 4.8 inches. So there is 1 inch of safety down from 10 inches of safety, and no one seems that concerned. What we found, to add to our worries, is that the erosion scientists were not talking to the climate change scientists. So, important report last summer that said that if the floods continue to increase in severity, which they will, and the droughts and the temperature, they expected the productivity of grain to drop by 35%. And we called up the lead writer at the Proceedings of the National Academy, and he was not aware that erosion was a problem. And here you have a classic problem with science. The atmospheric scientists have a very complicated world. They have focused all their life on it. And what do they know, I should say, about the guys in the building on the far side of the campus where they have muddy boots and they work with soil? And so we called up the soil scientists from that previous exhibit and talked to them, and they were not aware that climate change was a problem. So they knew that erosion was a real problem and would lower productivity by at least 10%, the erosion guys. The climate science knew it would reduce by 35. So we put together the first kludged amateur exhibit that John Holdren used in an official presentation the other day, formerly Obama's man for science, because it's the only thing that exists. that has attempted to adjust the erosion effect for increased flooding. The most dependable fact of climate change is that you will have more heavy floods. Erosion is a power law on heavy flooding. Rain and heavy rain even does not cause erosion. It is only the 1 or 2 monster storms a year that erode, sometimes gullies that are 4 feet deep. And those are exactly the kind of storms that have doubled, as Houston and other recent events have shown, and they will double and redouble again, even if we stop tomorrow. There's a lot of inertia in the system. Fertilizer, why have we done so well? Grains grow arithmetically, people grow exponentially. Malthus got it right. So why haven't we all starved? Because we had 2 amazing, unexpected great leaps. One was wipe out all the locals and take over the Americas, a huge amount of arable land, do the same in much of Russia, and that's a huge unexpected increase in output. And secondly, fertilizer. The realization that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium could make a bonanza compared to what you had to settle with before. Let me just point out that you can't grow any living thing without potassium and phosphorus, whether it's human, insect, or grain, and that we mine it. It's entirely finite by definition. We go in there, we mine it, we ship it, we scatter it around on the fields. And we can't farm without it, and it's finite. If that makes the hair, the back of my neck, always bristle a bit. It's a pretty scary formula. We have got to change our farming so that we don't need phosphorus and potassium from outside. And that means fully sustainable organic farming, which will take decades to change in a conservative business. And we haven't really begun. Another little tiny problem is that 75% plus or minus 10 of all the world's phosphorus that is cheap enough to count is in Morocco and Western Sahara, controlled by Morocco. If ISIS were to take control of Morocco, I give you my personal guarantee that within a week, the US military, the Chinese military, and/or the European military will have done something about it. We simply cannot exist without Morocco. Without Morocco, we have 50 years of phosphorus without any growth. With the kind of growth we need, we have 35 years. You could see how quickly one would be in a panic. The other problem for agriculture is the death of all the insect life. They represent 40% of the pollination, 40% of the value of all crops. Every plant, every flower needs pollination. All the fruit and nuts need pollination. And they're going out of business. 2 years ago, meticulous German study documented in German forest preserves, 63 of them, that since 1989, 75% of all flying insects by mass had gone missing. Just think about that. 75% of all flying insects have gone away since 1989 in forest preserves, not around a refinery. And then 2 months ago, it came out in also the National Academy, a report on Puerto Rico where they have a forest tropical reserve protected by the King of Spain long ago, and 75% of their flying insects had also gone missing, probably a different mix of reasons, and they thought the temperature increase was probably a key reason. And some East Anglian scientists, acting very quickly, grabbed a particular beetle species and gave it some heat waves, because the tropical forest doesn't have almost any differential in temperature. And the insects have spent millions of years acclimatizing to that. And suddenly the temperature in 30, 40 years has gone up 2 degrees centigrade, more than average. We don't know why. Maybe something to do with being an island. But it's gone up 2 degrees centigrade. And the distribution, instead of having the odd 4-degree one once a year, they now have 15 a year. And so in East Anglia, they got this beetle and they gave it a heat wave, 5 days of 4 degrees centigrade. And it halved their fertility. And then 2 weeks later, they came back with another heat wave, and they were sterile. And everybody wrote in who were studying mammals and so on and said, yes, heat is incredibly sensitive for sperm count. And while we're on the topic, human sperm count is down 50% in 50 years, and it was down already 50 years ago. It is dropping at 1% a year, and there is no sign of a decrease in that rate. So 50% in 50 years, no one cares, no one talks about it, it's not in the paper. Okay, how about 100% in 100 years? Would that get your attention? I mean, it is unbelievable what it takes to move the average person these days. But something as personal as sperm count, you'd think might get there, but it hasn't yet. And all insect life, all life forms seem to be deciding that we've created an environment that's simply not conducive to life. And what happens when the insects go missing? I can't find out. Why can't I find out? Because there are not enough scientists studying insects. Why not? I suggested it was a boring topic, and they said, no, the problem is you can't get funding. No one will go into insect study because they can't get any funding. So we don't know what the hell is going on in the insect world. We knew a lot about monarch butterflies because they're totemic. We knew a lot about honeybees because they're commercial, and we assumed they were unique. They are merely representative of a broad-based Armageddon. And all insects are biting the dust. What happens from 75, 85, 90? What happens to the soil, by the way? Leaf litter, dung, etc. Instead of getting eaten away by dung beetles and digested and made part of the soil, what happens to them? We have no idea of the cascade effect of insect loss. E.O. Wilson, the great ant-man, said, the planet can do perfectly well without humans. What it can't do without is insects. We assume the infinite capacity of the human brain is going to save us. I was at a very illustrious Tuesday club in London once, and they'll never invite me again for sure. And I was jet lagged, and I began to realize everyone in the room, other than the speaker, a former minister of the Conservative government, everyone was expected to make their contribution. So finally, the last person, I made my contribution, which was the prototype running out of everything, and quite a few years ago. And then one by one, including my friend who'd invited me, they hammered me for being an idiot and pointed out the infinite capacity of the human brain. And actually, it sounds good, but it is historically illiterate. Our brains have not changed since the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Mayans, and the rest of the boys. They all had the same infinite capacity of the human brain, and they all went out of business by making their empires too complex, by overusing their soil resources and other contributory stress on the environment, by being hubristic, by just assuming, hey, look at our viaducts, look at the fact we've beaten the barbarians back 19 times. We can go on forever. And 400 years is a long time until finally you run out of luck and your water storage systems are not deep enough for the Mayans or the barbarians get lucky. And overreach, soil, climate change, and bad luck. This is a Khmer palace. How am I doing for time? Somebody?
You just hit me.
Have I? Well, I was halfway. What do you know? Okay.
How many votes to let him keep going?
Okay, the race of our lives at double speed. We have a climate change portfolio at GMO. It looks perfectly predictable. Agriculture, however, is 20%. Copper, very good for electricity, energy efficiency, etc. And this is the divestment exhibit that got some attention. We took out each of the big groups of the market, 10 of them, and we looked at what would happen if you went on the other 9. And the answer was, we charted them all across the 30 years, and you can see it looks like one line. They're all the same. It makes no difference. Actually, getting rid of energy would have made you 3 bips. But I got guilty conscience. We went back all the way to 1925, and the range was the same. Plus or minus 25 bips is the cost of your ethics, okay? That is what it's going to do to your endowment. But it's just as likely to be positive as negative, unless you have an axe to grind on energy, which I do. It's going to cost you money to be in the oil business. in the end, they're fighting it too hard, they're not rolling with the punches, they're denying a lot of the stuff, and they're about to be overtaken by electric cars. CO2, between the ice ages at the bottom there and the interglacials, like today at the top, 5 of them, there's 100 points per million of carbon dioxide. It's amazingly efficient. Without carbon dioxide, it's minus 25 degrees. We're a frozen ball. Thank God carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. And what we've done is we've doubled it. This is a noble experiment. And we will double it again, unless we're lucky. We will certainly triple the original. And no one knows what effect that will have. We are accelerating in our damage. No scientist would say this until the last 18 months. Trump seems to have galvanized them. But I would say it 5 years ago, the 7 BIPs had gone to 15, and between the 2 El Niños to 25. This thing is accelerating. This is a color coding version from the Met Office. And the black line here is the 2,000 meters of the ocean, 1950 to 90, 37 units of heat extra per year, and in the last 26 years, 99. It has nearly tripled. And then there was a report the other day that said that 60% more heat had been absorbed by the oceans than had been calculated by the IPCC UN. And then a sharp-eyed skeptic found a math error and pointed it out, and indeed it was a math error, and it has been restated correctly. The math is corrected, and the restatement is the oceans have absorbed 10 to 70% more heat than the IPCC had recognized. So 40% more on average, plus or minus 30. This is not good news. This is terrible news. It means the Earth is just more sensitive to carbon dioxide than we had imagined. Everything we thought we had to do, we have to do 30, 40% harder. This is the melting of one of the great glaciers. That is an accurate picture, believe it or not. The US downpours are going through the roof. The damage, the floods, the drought mortality, this does not include the sad recent experience. And racing to the rescue, we have this amazing technology where the cost of utility solar and wind dropping like a stone has already outflanked coal. And you can, in 5 or 6 states now, you can get a wind farm cheaper to operate, fully costed, than the marginal cost of the best nuclear and the best coal plant, even if you give them away free. This is an amazing revolution. The wind power have gone from little toys, the giant windmills you ride past in Holland are 2 megawatt. And GE, if it lasts long enough, will deliver in 2022 a 12 megawatt turbine almost as big as the Eiffel Tower. When you double the wingspan, you quadruple the energy, pi r squared. And when you go up higher, you pick up more wind, and wind is cubed. 140 mile an hour hurricane is 40, 50% more powerful than 120, not 17. And then we had battery efficiency, storage efficiency that had been lagging, and then it exploded in the last 8 years. In 2010, Tesla would give you $1,000 charge you for a kilowatt hour. This year, it's probably 150. And just their technology will take that down to 75 in 5 years. But solid state will have that. I'm happy to say the Grantham Foundation is the biggest investment we ever made is in a solid state company that's delivered batteries to a European car firm. It's half the weight, half the volume, charges theoretically in 6 minutes, but let's say 10, and doesn't burst into flame. Just imagine you're trying to sell a telephone which has 1 day and takes 3 hours to charge, and the competitor has 2 days and charges in 10 minutes. You're out of business, right? And you extrapolate that all the way up to a Model S, a Tesla, it saves 600 pounds of utter dead weight that you no longer have to drag around. They are a little fat bottom, those beasts. I speak as a recent recipient of a Model 3, and they are more elegantly designed. The bad news is with all this progress, in 2050, it will still be over 50% fossil fuel, which guarantees that carbon emissions will rise even as fossil use peaks out. And it guarantees that by 2050 we will be at or close to 2 degrees centigrade. We have no hope of 1.5. We have no realistic hope of 2. We're going to have to fight and scrap, and some of you guys are going to have to get off your bottoms and start pulling your weight, nagging your organizations if we mean to stay below 3. And the damage that will be done at 3, we have no idea. My personal bet is that civilization as we know it, stable as it has been in the last 50 years, will not exist. Because I think Africa will collapse, and hundreds of millions, not hundreds of thousands. See what damage the hundreds of thousands did to Europe. And the liberal tradition of Europe had just melted away. And imagine, replace that with 20s and hundreds of millions trying to get in because they're desperate. And they're real refugees, by the way. As a failing state quickly is taken over by warlords, and they're real refugees. The massive amount of money needed to do this. In the trillions of dollars, everyone tells me these numbers are light, but they are huge. And just to finish up, another investment from the Grantham Foundation, this is what a car should really be like. Instead of 4,500 pounds of Model S carrying my 150 pounds around, this is 700 pounds of very sexy looking carbon fiber around a 1 or 2 seater motorbike if you prefer it, but it's comfortable, you sit back, carries the groceries, and uses fewer calories getting you to the supermarket than you do walking. It goes faster than a rocket ship, faster than anything else on the road in round numbers, and can take you 500 miles. And this is what the new, and will be automatic, self-drive, auto-drive. A plane, 5 years ago this was utterly impossible, and this is a plane that is trying desperately to come to the market with a range of 650 miles and passengers of 9 plus 2 pilots. And 60% of its weight is lithium-ion battery. When the new ones come out, that will be bang, 30% of the entire weight will be saved. You can add another 6 passengers, or you can add another 300 miles. It makes no noise, it can take off during the night, and it's 30% of the cost to service it. Electric motors have no moving parts, basically, and 30% of the running costs. These things will take over short haul, unlike anyone would have guessed. And this, to end up, is my car of 1.5 weeks vintage with 189 miles left in the garage. And if I wanted to show off, I could blow the hooter from here. Thank you.